Shalom and welcome to the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. We're looking today at Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 18, which I would remind you in your English Bible would be verse 19. Jeremiah is continuing this context in which last couple verses, he's called for the wailing women, those who will raise lamentation and mourning over the coming destruction of Jerusalem. He sees all of this in his vision and is announcing it. And he's going to continue this very somber and sobering imagery with this verse that we'll look at today. So let's go ahead and read our text in Hebrew as we get started. Ki kol nehi nishma mitzion, ech shudadnu, boshnu me'od, ki azavnu aretz, ki hishlichi mishkanotenu. So he's calling these wailing women to come and raise their lamentation. Well, why should they? Well, because a sound or a voice of lamentations. This is kol, meaning a sound or a voice. Here it's in construct with nehi. Not a very common word, but we did see it in the previous verse 17 in Hebrew, and the word that means wailing or lamentation or mourning, M-O-U-R-N, a mourning song. The sound of mourning or lamentation is heard. Now, you might recognize our common verb here, shama, meaning to hear. In this case, we have a perfect. It's going to be a 3ms, perfect, but it's going to be a nifal, and you probably picked that up from this ni right at the beginning of it as a prefix, so that's a typical nifal. So it's not we will hear or anything like that as an imperfect, but the sound is heard, so this is a nifal from shama. Pretty common use of the nifal here. A voice of mourning and lamentation is heard, and it's heard from, there's a min with the nun of the min assimilated into this tzadi over here, from Zion, another name for Jerusalem. This is the sound that's going forth from Zion because the city is in uproar, in torment. How? Now, ech. This is a word of exclamation, which we would probably translate as how. It can be used sometimes in a context of joy, how happy we would be, how glad we will be. But in this context, it's how devastated we are. Now, here's our verb here, shudadnu. Now, we see a nu at the end. We know this is going to be a perfect. This is going to be a first common plural. Now, it's from the verb shadad. We can tell that, that's a verb that usually means to ruin or to devastate, but here it's kind of an unusual form. You see this kibbutz underneath the beginning, a dagesh in the second letter, especially in a begad kafat letter, and we realize this looks like a pual, and that's exactly what we have here. So this is pual perfect, first common plural, from shadad. Now again, in the cow it means to ruin or to devastate, and the pl has a connotation of actually to assault, more intensive, and this is the passive of that. So we are assaulted, we are ruined, we are devastated. Very strong word here. How we have been devastated is the imagery that you hear. And another verb here, boshnu. Now this time you see the nu sufformative. So once again we have a perfect. It's going to be a first common plural. This time it's going to be a cow from our verb bosh, which means to be ashamed. Sheen like this, pardon me. Sheen like that. Let me get that back. Here we go. There, get it right. Okay. To be ashamed. And so we are ashamed greatly. Here's our adverb me'od, meaning very much so. So we are greatly ashamed. And why are we so ashamed? Because azavnu. Now, once again, perfect. First common plural here with this new sufformative on it. It's going to be a cow from our verb azav, which means to abandon, to forsake, to leave. Because we have abandoned aretz, land. Here it's not with an article, but that's pretty common, especially in poetic verse, which is what we have here. We have abandoned, we would have to say the land, but we have abandoned our land is the idea, the connotation, especially with the new here. We have abandoned the land or our land. Now you notice usually we're used to seeing eretz, but there's a little accent here, a little zakef over it, and that puts it a little bit in pause, which is what we have, a little change in the accent there. We're used to seeing that. And why have we had to abandon the land? Because, another conjunction here, this is going to give us the reason, because hishlichi Now, what do we have here? We have a hit at the beginning. That looks like a prefix. Hishliku, and we have the u at the end. What we're going to have here is going to be a perfect, another, in this case it's going to be a third common plural, and this is going to be a hifil, from our verb shalach. Now, if you know this verb, it's a fairly common verb, but we're going to put parentheses around it because we only find it in the hifil, sometimes in the hofal, but it's not used in the kal. And this means to throw, or in this context, to overthrow. So the subject is an indefinite third plural. So one has, or they have, literally, they have thrown, in this context of the following word, which is mishkan, which is a dwelling place, they have overthrown mishkanotenu. So what do we have here? Well, we see this enu at the end. We know that's going to be a pronoun suffix, with the nu especially. It's going to be a first common plural. And you have mishkanot. Well, mishkan, by itself, with the final nun right here, means a dwelling place. And frequently when you find it in, it's usually a masculine noun, and it probably still is here, even though we have this ot, because this form mishkanot is frequently found in poetry for dwellings. So it'd be our dwellings. They have overthrown our dwellings. They, obviously referring to the enemies, or an indefinite idea. We would say one has overthrown our dwellings, and sometimes it's actually best translated in English as a passive. Our dwellings have been overthrown, but it is an active. They have done this. So we can see this is why they've had to abandon their land, because their dwelling places have all been destroyed because of the destruction that has come from the invader, whom God has sent in chastising his people because of their own stubbornness. So they brought this upon themselves. Well, let's go ahead and hide our work and look just real briefly at a couple translations. There's very little variation, actually, in the major translations. I picked the New American Standard, the 2020 revision. For a voice or a sound of wailing is heard from Zion, how devastated we are. So that's pretty much a direct translation there, very literal. We are put to shame greatly. We are put to great shame, for we have abandoned the land because they have torn down our homes, our dwelling places. So pretty straightforward. And almost all our translations are going to be very, very similar. Just a little bit of variation I found in the New English Bible from across the ocean over there in Britain. Hark, hark, for a voice is heard. Hark, hark, lamentation is heard in Zion. Lamentation is heard for a voice. How fearful is our ruin, how we have been devastated. How great our shame. That's pretty much, that's a direct translation. These are a little bit more on the paraphrastic side. We have left our lands. We have abandoned them. Left is more than just casually leaving. This is direct intentional abandonment. And our houses have been pulled down because of the tragedy of what has come upon us. It's not a pretty picture, and Jeremiah's not done. He's going to continue hammering away at this imagery for the next couple verses. He wants his people to understand that it is a very serious thing to continue in their rebelliousness against their God, who does care for them so much. Well, check back with us as we continue working through Jeremiah chapter 9 in the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. Shalom.